Hi, welcome to this Fire Drill Friday teach-in. I want to introduce you to my dog, Tulia. Fire Drill Friday community has never met her because I couldn't bring her to DC with me because she had a seizure on the way to the airport. So I just want you to meet her, and I think she wants to get back down on the ground. I am so excited because I am with Kassie Siegel, who has been my guru in California, teaching me everything that I need to know about California and climate change and fossil fuels. She is an environmental lawyer at the Center for Biological Diversity. She has spent her entire career in climate law, from forcing the George W. Bush administration to protect polar bears under the Endangered Species Act. Thank you for that. Due to global warming, to leading lawsuits and organizing to stop fossil fuel extraction. Thank you for joining us at the teach-in, Kassie. It's great.
Thank you so much, Jane.
You know, you've helped me understand why California is strategic in the fight against climate change on a national and even on an international basis. Explain why it's so important, why what happens in this state is so important.
Yes, absolutely. And first, just thank you, Jane, for everything you've done and everything you're doing. Your message with Fire Drill Fridays, it's so clear, so urgent and inspiring. And we're so glad to have you back home here in California.
Yeah, me too.
And having Fire Drill Fridays here. It's so fantastic. Yeah, so California is seen as a leader, as an innovator, and it's often said, as goes California, so goes the world. And California is viewed as a climate leader, but what most people don't know is that California is also an oil state. And those two things just don't go together. And it may shock people to hear that 3/4 of the oil produced here is more climate damaging than the oil that comes from the tar sands of Alberta, Canada. And that tar sands oil is so dirty that most people have probably heard that building the Keystone Pipeline to bring it to market here would be game over for climate. And it's the same thing with the oil companies' dirty oil production here. So California just can't be a climate leader while these companies are digging up hundreds of millions of barrels a year of some of the world's dirtiest oil. It's like I'm trying to fill in a hole with this tiny little shovel, and the oil companies keep coming and they're filling it, they're digging it deeper with the front loader. So if we're going to hold up California as a model for the rest of the world to follow, we have to make it a model worth following. Mm-hmm. And there's one more thing right now about this is that during the Trump administration, we're mostly on the defense. In the environmental community, we're all working overtime to limit this horrendous damage that the Trump administration is doing to the air we breathe and the water we drink and our climate. And so the opportunities for progress are at the state and local level, and that's why it's doubly important that Governor Newsom here in California take bold action that matches the scale of the crisis.
Mm-hmm. Explain why the oil in California is so bad. Doesn't it have something to do with the fact that the good part of it has already been dug up?
Yes, exactly. So the oil industry has been allowed to drill at will for 150 years in our state. And so the easy oil is all gone. And so what they're doing to get it today is much more damaging. They have to drill more wells, and they have to use all these ultra hazardous techniques like fracking and like a very closely related technique called steam injection. And so they burn fossil fuels, usually fracked gas, to create energy, to boil water, to make steam, to inject it underground, to bring out this dirty, heavy, sludgy oil.
You know, I'm not sure people realize California is the 5th largest economy in the world, which explains part of why, as goes California, so goes the world. If we in California enact good car emissions rules. Because we're such a huge market, that forces Detroit and the car manufacturers to make cars that meet these demands for everybody, so everybody ends up having good emission cars. Now Trump is trying to roll it back, right? But
yes,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. What happens here is incredibly important. And that's why we say we need California to be a first mover
Yeah.
on fossil fuel extraction, because the fact is we have to stop the expansion of the fossil fuel industry and start phasing it out and end the fossil fuel era. And there's no place in the world that's better suited than California, with our healthy, diverse economy, our reputation for innovation, clean tech, the booming renewable energy industry, to start that phase out of dirty oil extraction than right here. Yeah.
You know what was a big aha for me in the last half year? Jerry Brown, our former governor, was a friend of mine. My former husband, Tom Hayden, worked with Jerry Brown to create a robust solar energy market in California. In the 70s, we had a windmill at a ranch that we had where there was a children's camp. We had solar collectors. There was a tax rebate for having solar collectors. This was all a booming thing that was helped by Jerry Brown. So I thought, well, you know, we're solving our climate problems. I didn't realize that Jerry Brown, Mr. Climate Governor, never took on oil. And that no matter how many windmills and solar panels we had, if he continued to allow oil companies to drill and frack, we were certainly not moving forward. If anything, we were going back, because the oil was becoming worse and worse. So this need now to say, fine, we need a clean energy sector that has to become even more robust. But we have to stop the fossil fuel, because as long as they keep drilling, it's going to undo any good effects that we have from the clean energy sector. But as you've helped me understand, oil has run the economy of California for longer than I've been alive, right? They've kind of controlled the politics of California.
Yeah, yeah. The power that the oil companies wield here is immense. And so another dimension of this problem is that as long as the oil companies get to do whatever they want, go out there, produce all the oil you want, cause all the damage, ignore our environmental laws, make people sick, they're still raking in these huge profits, and they're just using a tiny little bit of those profits to block all the other climate policies that we need here in California. So our state has made some progress. We lead the country in a number of ways, but we're not going to get to where we need to go until Governor Gavin Newsom actually starts protecting Californians instead of oil companies and starts to rein in that power.
Yeah. Another thing that you've helped me understand is how many communities in California live right next to oil wells, fracking sites, and refineries. And in the Fire Drill Fridays that we've been doing in California, we're hearing from these frontline voices about the health impacts that this has. You know, young 16, 17-year-old girls dying of cancer, having their reproductive organs removed because they have cancer, because the refinery casts a shadow over their schools and their homes. So one of the things that we're fighting for here is to get a health and safety buffer zone, right, that says no fossil fuel infrastructures closer than 2,500 feet to homes. Now, is that a scientific distance, or who came up with that 2,500 feet?
Yes, it is scientific, and the science shows that living next to oil wells makes people really sick. In the longer term, the studies show that you have an increased risk of cancer from carcinogens like benzene, and also increased risk of birth defects and low birth weight babies. So the toxic chemicals from these operations even hurt babies in their mother's wombs. It's really, really shocking. And the literature shows you're at greatest risk within about half a mile from the well. Yeah. And when you're living there on a day-to-day basis, it's the children and elderly who are most at risk. And these kids in Los Angeles, they have nosebleeds, they have headaches, they get nauseous from this stuff. It's just absolutely awful. And in California, we have kids that are playing like yards from an active oil well, and it's so bad for their developing lungs and for their overall well-being. So it's really shocking, and that's why the people in these communities, and of course, it's not the harm isn't equal. It's low-income communities and communities of color that are disproportionately hit with this stuff, have the majority of these dirty oil operations, and that's why leaders from these communities, including these amazing youth leaders, are leading this fight to address this crisis, and we can all join them in saying no drilling where we're living.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we're fighting for, a safety and health buffer zone of 2,500 feet, and we're asking Governor Newsom and Mayor Garcetti here in Los Angeles to do this, because I think there's a blue ribbon science panel that has come, that did research and said this is the right distance for safety, and even then it's questionable, but that's the minimal, right?
Yes, exactly. And so back in 2013, the California legislature passed a piece of legislation and directed the California Council on Science and Technology to do the first ever statewide review of the harms of fracking in California. And what these scientists concluded is that the health harm comes not just from fracking, but from all oil and gas activities. And they reviewed the literature that we've just been talking about, and they recommended that California institute the public health and safety buffer that we're still asking for today. They said, do a buffer, and we find that the health harms are greatest within half a mile. I mean, they didn't say, I mean, you know, we're calling for no less than half a mile.
And that's 2,500 feet?
Yes, about 2,500 feet, exactly. And that Blue Ribbon Scientific Panel made that recommendation in the summer of 2015.
Yeah.
And nothing has been done.
Right, right. So that's one of the things that Governor Newsom needs to do. And by the way, if he did that, and if he, you know, if he said, we're not going to have any new permits for new wells or new fracking here in California, he would become an international climate leader, right?
More than anything else, we see this as this phenomenal opportunity for the governor to be the leader that we all need, and to do the big, bold things that our young people are calling for and we so desperately need to address the climate dimensions of the problem and the health dimensions and the environmental justice dimensions of this crisis. And it's the right thing to do, and it sure seems like the smart political thing to do.
Will you explain why fracking should be banned?
Yeah, so banning fracking is so critical, and I think most people probably know that fracking is bad, and you don't want the frackers moving in next door. They will poison the air you breathe and the water you drink, and they will ruin your quality of life. But there is also the climate risk with fracking. So the North American oil and gas glut that's going on right now is driven entirely by fracking. And 90% of future oil and gas development going forward depends on fracking. So fracking is the thing that makes it possible for these companies to go dig up this oil and gas that we can't afford to burn. So a fracking ban is essential for our health. It's essential for our climate. We need Governor Gavin Newsom to do it here in California, and we need the next president to do it immediately when they set foot in the Oval Office.
There's the flares also, right, from the fracking
There's the flares
that
from
releases
the methane.
methane.
So methane is a super pollutant. It's many, many times more powerful than carbon dioxide, particularly in the short term at warming the climate. So it's really, really important that we slash methane emissions globally, and the oil and gas industry is the #1 culprit when it comes to methane emissions. We can buy ourselves a little time if we really do a good job cutting all that methane. And I've actually been working on methane since 2007. And we've known since then basically what we know now, #1, about how bad it is, but #2, about how easy and cost effective it is to stop all the sources of methane leaks we have. And the oil and gas industry has fought all these common sense measures relentlessly. It's one of the things I find it hardest to forgive them for, because super pollutants like methane are pushing us ever faster towards what are called tipping points, or the points of no return, like the melting of those ice sheets. Yeah.
Explain why fracking does so much damage to the communities that are close to fracking infrastructures. What is it about fracking?
Yeah, so fracking uses a tremendous amount of toxic chemicals, and when I think of the dangers of fracking, I often think about Laura Amos. And she's a young mother. She was living in Colorado, and her drinking water well exploded in an early fracking-related accident. This happened quite a while ago. And regulators came to her house and they examined her well, and they said, "Your well is fine. It's safe to drink the well water." And Laura Amos went on for 3 years drinking that water, and she nursed her infant daughter, washed her daughter in this water, and then she was diagnosed with an adrenal tumor. And that's a very rare form of cancer that's caused by a chemical called 2-butoxyethanol. And Laura Amos sued the company. They tried to deny that they used 2-butoxyethanol, but through the litigation, it was proved that they did, and Laura Amos got a settlement from that company. But of course, you can't ever get your health back. And what I learned is that 2-butoxyethanol is one of the most commonly used chemical in California. It's used all the time with no protection, and it's totally unacceptable. And so what is doubly senseless about all this damage from fracking is that it's all being done for oil and gas that needs to stay in the ground.
And what is the relationship, do you think, between fracking and earthquakes?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that not just the fracking, but also even more so, the injection of the wastewater from fracking causes earthquakes. There's many, many instances of this documented around the world, and including in California, by the way. And in California, we do not have a system in place that is capable of, in most instances, tracing the source of many of the earthquakes back to the oil and gas activities. So sometimes we do, but one of the reasons we don't have more information is because the oil and gas companies have evaded the type of regulation and the type of oversight that would give us more information and help us do more to protect against these quakes that are triggered by the fracking industry.
Now, there's a big study happening as we speak. It's being done with Stanford, is it? Or
I think you're referring to the University of California study on how California can phase out its oil production, being done out of UC Santa Barbara, I believe.
yeah, that's the Just Transition
Yes.
Study. How do we transition off of fossil fuel in such a way that the communities that are dependent on fossil fuel, like the San Joaquin Valley, and the workers will either retire with good benefits or get new jobs with equally high pay and benefits, correct?
Yes.
And that's being developed. But there's another one, too, having to do with the dangers of fracking, I think.
There are a couple of studies, major studies that have been launched, and Governor Newsom has done some good things.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a
Yeah,
second.
I mean, he became the first governor of a major oil-producing state to announce that oil extraction has to be phased out here in California, and that's historic, and it's really important because the world over, people are looking to California to see what's going to happen.
And he is the first governor that has named fossil fuels as a problem, right?
Exactly, exactly. And he launched some concrete steps towards that end.
Yeah.
Part of that is the studies that you've been describing, major study on just transition and how we phase out production, also a big study on how we accelerate electrification of the vehicle fleet and other ways so we slash our oil use in California. And he has also launched a process to protect public health. He has not committed to the result of that process being the health and safety buffer that we need, and he needs to do that because the only way to protect public health from urban oil drilling is to get rid of the oil wells. He needs to do more. He needs to stop approving new oil wells. There's still thousands of new oil wells going in each year in California, but he has been far, far better than Governor Jerry Brown and has done some good things for which we give him credit.
Yeah. There are, this is kind of a complicated issue that I want you to help people understand. There are many wells that are only partly producing. There are other wells that are called orphaned wells that don't produce anymore, but they haven't been, what's the word?
It's
Mitigated, what is the word?
Well, it's sometimes called plugged and abandoned, which is a little bit technical, but we like to say secure the well and clean it up.
And clean it up.
Yeah, and there's legal requirements that the oil companies are subject to when they get their permit to drill. At the end, you have to secure the well, so you have to fill it with concrete, and then you need to take away the equipment and all the junk that's out there on the site and clean it up. And this goes back to how long the oil industry has been operating here, and all the intensity of what they're doing. There's over 100,000 oil wells in California, and the cost of just doing those legally required cleanup operations is at least $9 billion.
That's a billion with a B.
That's from another new study by this California Council on Science and Technology. And about 5,000 of those wells are already what we call orphaned. So that means that the oil company that was responsible for them has gone bankrupt, or it's otherwise just skipped out of town, and nobody is taking care of that well. And then those costs get put off onto the public. And it's $500 million just to clean up the wells that are already orphaned. And the blockbuster that you just alluded to is that there's 70,000 wells in California that are either idle, they're not producing anything, or they're producing less than 5 barrels a day. And so what this is showing you is that this industry is already in decline. I mean, we know that. Production in California has been declining.
And the industry knows that.
They sure do.
Yeah, right.
They sure do. And they have no intention of honoring their obligations.
What they do, some of the companies, they sell to smaller companies, then the wealthy companies skip town, and the little oil companies that have bought these things can't afford to pay for the remediation. That's the word I've been looking for. Is that the right word?
Exactly.
The cleanup
Yes.
of the wells.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
As Kassie said, we the taxpayers get stuck with the bill. And it's enormous. It's enormous. And of course, okay, so explain why it's important to not dig new wells, because, if the profits keep plummeting and we say close it up, then there's a taking, or what is that?
Well, so it
becomes more complicated.
Oh yes. So a couple different dimensions. I mean, as we were just talking about, number one, the liability.
Yeah.
So some of these companies they're on the brink of bankruptcy, and they're still getting permits to drill new wells. There's no way they can ever clean those up.
Yeah.
So that's just one aspect of the financial liability. The legal liability that you're referring to is that it is way easier to prevent something new, a new bad thing from happening in the first place than it is to shut it down once it's already going on. And so it is just crazy to keep giving these oil companies new permits to go out there and get started, because once you tell them no more, you have to shut it down, they fight about that. And the government can do that. The government can definitely shut down existing wells. They can phase stuff out, but it's harder. And what's super easy is just saying, no, you can't have a new permit, because no oil company has a right to get one of these permits. The government is supposed to decide. Is it worth it to give you this permit or not?
So we met with Governor Newsom, who was good enough to give us an hour meeting. Kassie was there at the meeting, and we talked about the issues that we're talking about now with him. And you know, I feel for him because, well, when you're governor of a state like California, you've got everything coming at you. You know, everybody's got a beef, and there's so many things that you have to deal with. For example, you know, we talked about the necessity of stopping new oil wells and of closing down wells that are close to communities where people live. And he was telling us what a problem he has in the San Joaquin Valley, where there's so many of these oil wells, because he just closed down private prison in the San Joaquin Valley. And he said, you know, all these people have lost their jobs, so they're coming at me because, you know, of all these job loss. How can I then go to the fossil fuel industry and close down those wells? And, you know, I thought, oh my God, there's all the jobs that could be had remediating the wells. The workers that are working on already working, you know, the wells that are still working could be paid to clean those up and move to others that are orphaned and clean those up. Would you talk about that? Because, I mean, pretend like the camera is Gavin Newsom and explain to him why it's kind of like a no-brainer. It's a win-win.
Yeah. So I think that the concern for working people is absolutely sincere, and it's very admirable. But the thing is that the oil industry is a dangerous boom and bust industry that has never treated its workers well, and it never will. And that industry does not have any intention of honoring its commitments to its workers. And what's happening now in the coal industry is a cautionary tale of what we may see here in California with oil and gas. There's coal workers who have literally had to block the trains taking the coal to market in order to get the back pay that they're owed from their company that has gone bankrupt. And we need Governor Newsom to be asking the oil companies, what is your plan to support your workers and to be able to honor your obligations for their health care and for their pensions and your environmental remediation obligations? The truth is that investment in the clean energy economy overall is going to produce many, many more jobs than doubling down on fossil fuels. And in the short term, the silver lining of the $9 billion worth of remediation that needs to be done on California's oil and gas wells is that provides good jobs in the same industry right now in the short term to help us out as we jumpstart that just transition to clean energy. And so we have been hearing excuse after excuse from the fossil fuel industry for decades, and we're simply out of time. The truth is that we have to get started ending the fossil fuel economy, and we need you to do it, and we're looking for your leadership, and we are here and ready to celebrate your continued leadership on this issue.
Yeah, we want to be able to crown you as the climate savior. We want to be so proud of you. And then maybe one day you can run for president and we'd be behind you. When Governor Newsom talked about closing down the private prisons, and you know, how difficult it was because all those workers, and it's not just guards, but it's cooks and it's cleanup people and it's just so many different sectors out of work. And I thought, wow, the concept of a fair transition could apply to the prison system just as it could to fossil fuels, which means before closing them down, if the governor's people had sat down with labor, with all of the unions involved in the prison industrial complex, and discussed how do we transition these workers from a private prison into other sectors of the economy, it could have been a win-win. And the only way that we can talk about that is because this is being done in other parts of the world, in Germany, in Norway, in Spain, in France, in many other countries. This kind of fair transition is taking place. We have to make sure that it happens here in California, in all sectors of the economy, right?
Yes, you're so right, Jane. That's exactly it. The government needs to do a better job supporting all of our workers, our teachers and our nurses and our firefighters. Absolutely. So we need to make those resources available to people in the fossil fuel industry so they can continue to have good family sustaining jobs. But we can't delay the necessary climate action any longer because it's literally the fate of the entire planet hanging in the balance. Scientists say we've got 10 years to cut emissions in half. So continued delay is the same as failure. So we just have to get going,
Yeah. And another thing that I've learned in the last few months that I hadn't realized, the reason that it's so urgent now is not because it's just something that just happened, but talk about what the fossil fuel industry knew and what they did when they found out and when they found out what they were doing.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing what the fossil fuel polluters did. They knew about the science of climate change and the harm caused by their products for decades.
Well, 50 years.
Yes, and they didn't decide to start transitioning their businesses to provide clean, renewable energy to address the problem. Instead, they manufactured these massive disinformation campaigns. They lied about it, and they relentlessly blocked all the clean energy solutions that would have made alternatives to their dirty products available. And that is, it's just hard to understand how these fossil fuel executives could be willing to put literally the well-being of the entire world at risk just for a couple more years of profits. But it's also a tremendous source of legal liability to them. So there are a lot of local governments here in California and some states suing the world's largest fossil fuel polluters right now to get them to pay for the damage of climate change. And the liability, it's not just based on the fact that fossil fuels cause the problem and are the number one source of emissions. It's based on the fact that they knew it, they lied about it, and they blocked alternatives so they could sell more fossil fuels.
Yeah, right. I mean, they blocked the Copenhagen Climate Treaty meeting, and they've tried to undermine the Paris climate. Trump didn't even have to he didn't have to bother to pull us out because the fossil fuel industry was undermining it from day one, right?
They sure did.
Yeah.
They sure did.
I mean, the scientists, the fossil fuel industry, Exxon and Shell, for example, they had their own climate scientists. And the climate scientists told them, and the reason, this isn't just something that, us climate activists are talking about. We know this because lawsuits have uncovered internal documents now that reveal to us what the climate scientists told the executives of Exxon and Shell in the 60s and 70s, that the Arctic ice sheet was going to melt, that whole countries were going to be underwater, that the mid part of of America was going to be underwater, was going to be desert. I mean, all of this was predicted They also said, I believe, that people were going to have to completely change the way they lived, that it was uncertain where people would get water to drink. And the executives heard this and they doubled up their drilling. And they said, well, this isn't as bad as a nuclear holocaust, so let's just keep going. And they used the same tactics, right, that the tobacco companies used. They said, if we can sow doubt in people's minds about whether this is true, well, there's two sides to this story. So then they said, we'll be victorious. Well, guess what? There is not two sides to this story. 97% of climate scientists agree. We are facing a catastrophe if we don't do what Kassie said, cut fossil fuel emissions in half in 10 years, and then phase out gradually with a just transition to net zero by 2050, by mid-century, right?
Yes, and that's such a good summary of what the fossil fuel polluters did. And the thing is, they're still at it. And so the tactics are shifting a little bit from this hard denial, just pushing just the disinformation, to now it's more the oil companies want to be part of the solution, but they're offering us false solutions. Mm-hmm. So when an oil company wants to sell you a climate solution, don't buy it, because they're peddling all these ideas that would just, get more for them and be just a complete disaster. Right. And we just can't afford any more delay.
There's a big campaign now. Huge amounts of money are going from the fossil fuel industry into a campaign saying natural gas, that's what gets brought up through the fracking process, is essential for national security. This is the essential bridge energy that will take us to a time when the alternatives like solar and wind can work, because of course they don't work now. We have to have something that will bridge us over till that time, and it's essential to our national security. What people don't realize is they want to keep fracking, and that's all exported. If it's so important for our national security, why are we exporting it? It's all a lie, right?
Yeah.
Talk about the scissor. The scissor metaphor.
Yeah, so that is such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful metaphor for environmental policy. And it's from this very influential paper by these two brilliant guys. And they talk about environmental policy as a pair of scissors. And you cut away the bad thing that you want to get rid of with both blades of the scissors. So one blade is the production of the bad thing, and the other blade is the consumption of the bad thing. So, for example, when we learned asbestos is a deadly substance, the government didn't say, well, let's just ban the use of asbestos in buildings, but go ahead, asbestos companies, keep producing as much as you want. Of course, they didn't do that. Policy goes together. But with fossil fuels, there has been this notion forever, pushed by the polluters themselves, of course, that if we just focus on smokestacks and tailpipes, we should just ignore fossil fuel production. And of course, that doesn't work, because fossil fuel production is 3/4 of the emissions leading to the problem, and no climate policy can succeed unless it limits the amount of fossil fuels coming out of the ground. And that amount of production has to be limited to no more than the amount scientists say we can burn before we trigger total catastrophe.
So this is fossil fuel, this is no fossil fuels, this blade, and this blade is solar and wind and geothermal. We need both blades to solve the climate crisis. Is that?
Yes, exactly. And you hear all the time, it's really wrong-headed to work on fossil fuel production, because as long as we're still using fossil fuels, we can't get going on fossil fuel production. And that is just this lie manufactured by the industry. It is absurd when you think about it. Of course, we need to accelerate all of our policies, but for decades...
Policies for the clean energy, electric trains, electric cars, and creating a grid and things. That's what you mean by policies.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And the alarming fact is that right now there's more than enough oil, gas, and coal in fields and mines globally that if the companies get to dig it all up, it's going to heat the world way more than the 1.5 degrees that scientists say is the max. That they say that is the max we can go to. If we go above 1.5 degrees, it's going to be a total catastrophe. That's why we say 1.5 to stay alive.
Explain what what is 1.5?
So 1.5 degrees, and this is talking Celsius, would be the amount of global average temperature rise of the air, global average temperature. So it's just an easy, simple way of measuring the climate change.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what is the what if? If we don't meet the target, what will happen?
All kinds of really bad things, and we're actually in the middle of it now. And so and it's happening, everything's happening much faster than scientists projected it would even just a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing all of these climate-fueled superstorms. That's because air temperature has gone up. When air temperature goes up, the oceans are also warming. You have stronger storms. You have higher wind speeds. You have more moisture in the storm. It's all intensified by climate change, and we have cities being destroyed by these superstorms. We have sea level rise. We have the great ice sheets of the world, the Greenland ice sheet and the ice sheets in Antarctica melting far, far faster. I mean, really, really frightening stuff. You know, these intense fires here in California, horrible, horrible destruction in Australia, around the world. And so we have to get started now because we're already committed to a certain amount of this ongoing damage.
So it's no matter what we do, it's going to get worse for a while.
It's going to get worse for a while, and it's hard to even really wrap your mind around the scale of the damage. However, the things we need to do to address it are all things that are going to make the world better, safer, healthier, more equitable place for all of us. So to me, that's what has been so exciting about working on this issue all these years. But it's, you know, many people are dying. Many animals are at risk of extinction. And it's hard. It's, you know.
The World Health Organization says that by 2050, by mid-century, there'll be 200 million climate refugees. Where do they go? What do they do? And, you know, in the course of the Fire Drill Fridays, and I've learned so much, I've realized that the oxygen that we breathe comes from two sources, the ocean and the forests. And phytoplankton in the ocean is one of the things that creates our oxygen, and phytoplankton is losing its ability to do that now. Forests, we're losing forests through fire, through cutting down, through deforestation. So the two parts of our lungs are being really challenged. So, I mean, plus fresh water. The fossil fuel industry, it's not just sending the things that warm up the climate into the air, it's sending pollutants into the water, into the ground, into the communities that we're talking to with Fire Drill Fridays. So many parts of the world don't have safe water anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the remaining water is being privatized, so you have to pay for it. And many people in the world can't afford to pay for it. So the extent of inequality is escalating rapidly, along with the heating of climate, which is also the beautiful challenge, is that we're alive at a time when we can actually change the trajectory of human civilization by solving inequity and climate at the same time. They kind of go together, right? So it's a challenge, but it's a very exciting time. We can make the difference. We can all be climate heroes.
That's so beautifully said, and I think that's exactly the way we have to do it. And that's why everybody has to join Fire Drill Fridays and follow Jane.
Yeah, or whatever. But an organization, whether it's Fire Drill Fridays or Greenpeace, an activist organization. You know, there are environmental organizations that will not take on the fossil fuel industry, you know, and they do important work, conservation, you know, protecting species. This is all very good, but they're not talking about the central problem, which is fossil fuels, right? So if you're going to join an organization that is not afraid to address the problem of fossil fuels. And the other thing, you know, what I love about scientists today, because scientists are basically nerds, right? I mean, thank God for scientists. They make it all possible in a way. But scientists historically want to stay under the radar. You know, they don't want no attention. I'm not political. I'm totally objective in what I'm doing. And that's really what they try to be, right? And now the doors of laboratories are being flung open, and these guys and women are running out in their white lab jackets saying, people, this is a catastrophe. Scientists don't do this, and they're doing this now. This is a catastrophe. And what I love is that they're saying the only way we're going to solve it is to have unprecedented numbers of people mobilized. Scientists are telling us that. And so that's why we're doing Fire Drill Friday, and why I love Greenpeace is we have to mobilize in unprecedented numbers to force our government, no matter who's running it, to do the right thing. And you know, there's a lot of doom and gloom, but there's also a lot of victories. The largest tar sands mine that was about to go into production in northern Alberta, Canada, that would have destroyed thousands and thousands of acres of boreal forest and peatlands and caribou and all kinds of precious species. It was canceled. The permit for it was canceled because the indigenous communities there and their supporters blocked transportation, blocked the buses, blocked the trains. Everything came to a halt, and the permit was pulled. That is one example of how citizen activism is essential in stopping the fossil fuel advancement, right?
Yes, people united can beat the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
It's happening and they're scared. But this is why Fire Drill Fridays is so inspiring and so exciting, because we have to get organized and everybody has to get involved.
Yeah.
And follow Jane.
Together. Like if you have money invested in Chase, JP Morgan Chase Bank, which is the #1 funder of the fossil fuel industry, don't just quietly on your own do away with your Chase card and your credit card that Chase, I think it's called the Sapphire card or something like that. Write a letter to the bank saying why you're doing it. Video yourself cutting up your Chase card and put it out on social media. Let it be known why you're doing this, because it's our aggregate numbers of people that are going to make them realize, oh my gosh, if I keep doing this, we're going to lose all our money. Right?
Yep. They will change. If enough people do that, they will absolutely change.
Right.
For sure. And when enough people do that to the government, we'll get the government regulation we need to get the polluters to do what they will never do voluntarily.
Yeah. Describe to people what is the Last Chance Alliance.
The Last Chance Alliance is a very diverse coalition of more than 750 organizations. We are conservation, faith, environmental justice, health, labor, youth, all these different kind of groups united in our call on Governor Gavin Newsom to start protecting Californians instead of the oil industry. And we have 3 demands. We want him to stop approving new fossil fuel projects, stop approving new oil wells. We want him to drop existing production by starting the phase out of existing extraction here with the just transition that protects the workers and the communities that are most affected. And we want him to roll out that half-mile health and safety buffer to protect public health. And he's done some good things, but he needs to do more. And it has been so wonderful working with the Last Chance Alliance. It's actually the most exciting campaign I've ever been involved in. And I think one of the things that makes it most special and powerful is that together we're working on the climate dimensions and the health dimensions and the environmental justice dimensions equally, holding all these three things equally, and I think that's how we're going to win.
Yeah.
In addition to all of the amazing work you've done with Fire Drill Fridays.
But we're part of the Last Chance.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I should have said 750 organizations, including Fire Drill Fridays. But recently, as you've launched these Fire Drill Fridays here in California, calling directly on Governor Newsom to do these things, I think it's been a total game changer and has just helped build this momentum that's been like building for a decade to get these things.
Let's talk about open pit. The open pit issue. California, if I'm correct, is one of the only, if not the only state that allows toxic contaminated waters and sludge to be dumped in uncovered pits.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest environmental problems caused by oil and gas production in California is that to get the oil companies have to also bring up all this water with it. And the water is very salty. It has the chemicals from the petroleum itself in there, and then all those disgusting toxic chemicals that are used for production. Sometimes it's radioactive. And so it's this massive toxic waste disposal problem, and there's nothing good that you can do with all this toxic wastewater. And so they do various things. Sometimes they inject it back underground, but very frequently they simply dump it into unlined open pits. California is one of the only places in the country while this is still going on, and all those chemicals leach down and contaminate the groundwater. They, many of them are volatile, so they also go into the air and cause air pollution. It's still going on today.
Whew, boy, it must be so dangerous for farm workers.
It's incredibly dangerous for farm workers. Yeah, so I was just talking about the dumping, but as you know, some of this wastewater is also used to irrigate food crops. And it's not just the danger from the chemicals potentially getting into the food we eat, but for the people who are working in those fields, it's absolutely an atrocious risk. And I don't want to eat food that's irrigated with toxic oil wastewater, and I don't think most people do either. But if you're buying halo oranges, for example, in California, or cuties, you may very well be eating a piece of fruit that was grown with toxic wastewater.
Is there a way that people can know, a website or some way they can know which fruits and vegetables come from those places?
There is some information available, yes, but it's very hard to trace because the regulation is extremely poor. And the state of California launched an oversight committee to look into this. But meanwhile, it's still going on, and state regulators seem to continue to be convinced that increasing this practice is a good idea. And California is a water-starved state. That is true, but we're going to bitterly regret in the dry years ahead all the damage that these companies were allowed to do to our water supplies. And using oil and gas wastewater to grow food is just not the answer.
What else do you think people should know about the reality of fossil fuel in general, or specifically here in California? What have we not touched on?
You know, I think the most important thing is for people to get politically active and join Fire Drill Fridays, start taking action, because so often these conversations start and end with what can people do to reduce their own carbon footprint. And you know, there's all these good things you can do, and they're great, you know. Get solar panels. My personal favorite, replace your fracked gas stove with clean induction cooking. And all those are good things, but the fossil fuel industry has actually very intentionally run this campaign to make people think that climate change is a problem that's caused by and can be solved by individual choices. And that's just not true. In fact, the choices that are available to us are controlled by government policy, and the fossil fuel industry has had a chokehold on that government policy, and that's why the choices aren't available. That's why it's so important for people to get involved.
To turn concern into activism.
Yes.
And now is the time. Right now, we have very little time. Obviously, what we do between now and November is critical. When you vote, vote with the climate in your mind. Vote for courage, vote for boldness, and be prepared to join with large numbers of people come inauguration time to hold whoever gets elected to hold their feet to the fire. It's going to take a large army of us to do this. Please join the army. You can follow Fire Drill Fridays on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and if you want to really get involved and maybe start a local Fire Drill Friday or find out where we're holding Fire Drill Fridays, you can text Jane to 877-877. Thanks for watching.